Unto the Hills by Margaret Walker Freel. Chapter 20. "What's the war news?" asked old Abram Collett as he entered the trading post. "There's at least one piece of good news. I told you old Zeb Vance was a trash mover. First thing he did was send Captain Thomas Crossan to England to get a ship for our state. North Carolina's got to send cotton across to get sugar, coffee, guns, and ammunitions. They say Captain Crossan got a fast ship and has named it the Advance. The Yankees have got Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and Galveston pretty well blockaded, but Wilmington on our coast is a good harbor, and even with the blockade, ships can manage to sneak in and out at night." "I knew you'd be talking war," said Thomas C. Tatham as he joined in. "What's the latest?" "Lincoln and the folks in Washington still say there won't be any peace till the seceded states rejoin the Union. Then President Davis said the seceded states had the right to secede and become free and independent states, and that we owed no allegiance to the federal government. Looks like a deadlock to me." "What about the old countries? Do you think England and France will help any of us?" "Their sympathy seems to be with us, but that's about all. Everybody hoped and thought they would recognize the Confederacy, but it looks like they have a wait-and-see attitude." "How do we stack up against the efforts of the other Confederate states?" "We're doing more than our part. Our troops are furnished with better clothes and guns than any other states in the Confederacy. We've even helped some of the other states out." "What about our money? Will that hold out?" "That's our biggest worry. The value of our money isn't good. In fact, I fear we are living on hope." This sobering thought brought an end to the discussion, and each man went on his way. Margaret paused in her task of supervising the blacks in the field when she saw a bird close by. "Goodness gracious, there's an old jaybird. That's a sign of bad luck. Pa said it would always be a sign of something bad coming." Uncle Bob commented, "I don't like them old jaybirds neither. They's mean and fights the good birds. Some folks say they's tied up with the devil." "Pa used to say that the jaybird sold himself to the devil for a grain of corn, and that he's been carrying stuff to the devil ever since to pay off. Pa said the jaybird reported the sins of the people to the devil so he could keep up with his friends." "Them jays ain't the only mean birds. The brown thrashers gets in about as much mischief. Just as soon as a grain of corn gets out to grow in the ground, he scratches it up and eats the corn, then leaves the 2 blades of corn a layin' there just to make you mad." "Mr. Walker don't like them either. Sometimes, when he has time, he shoots them. I wonder what bad luck is going to come on account of the jaybirds." "You can just look out, it'll come. I've never known it to fail. Something bad is bound to happen." Superstition or no, they didn't have to wait long for bad luck to hit them. Just as the garden crops were gleaming in tender green rows, frost, with one icy sweep of its hand, destroyed the entire crop. "All that work for nothing," moaned Uncle Bob as he surveyed the damage. "I guess it could be worse," said Margaret, trying to be optimistic. "This must be sheep shearing winter. We took the wool from the sheep last week because it was so warm and they were suffering. There's an old saying that the weather always gets bad following sheep shearing. Sure looks like that's what's happened this year." Then came the proclamation from President Lincoln concerning the freeing of the slaves. All the valley population was at the trading post to hear the reading of the proclamation. "Tell us what it says," they requested. "Remember that being up here in the mountains, it takes a long time for news to get to us," Billy was explaining as best he could. "It seems that just after the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln announced that all slaves in the states which were in rebellion against the United States would be free." Old Thomas Tatham broke in. "But, Squire, what about them blacks in the states that didn't secede? Will they be freed too?" "According to what I understand, slavery will still be legal in what is called the border states, which will remain loyal to the Union." This didn't seem right, but the real question was posed by Mr. Tatham when he asked, What's going to happen to these freed blacks? Who's going to feed and clothe them or give them a roof to sleep under? Just answer me that." Margaret felt she could answer that, at least to her own satisfaction, and she said, "We all know that slavery, the buying and selling of human beings, isn't right. It has been wrong from the beginning. But slave or free, for my part, I love our blacks, and ours won't need for anything if they choose to stay with me. They will always have food, clothes, a roof, and care as long as we have anything." This statement seemed to be the sentiment of most of the group, yet they were still concerned. "What do you think is Lincoln's reasoning behind the proclamation? Is there anything we can do?" "You sure put forth a hard question. I don't guess anyone can answer. I guess it depends pretty much on how this war turns out. If we win, we won't have to abide by any of the decisions made in Washington. Richmond is our capital. But if we should lose—" There was a pause, and the consequences of this last half-statement was turned over in each mind present. Then Billy added, "I'll tell you one thing. It was pretty good politics on the part of Lincoln. This will make it look like the whole war is a crusade against slavery. Lots of people will fall for that. It will strengthen the cause of the Union in the North and in Europe. It makes the South look immoral and is a blow to the Confederacy." Margaret rose as she prepared to leave. Her parting remark was taken to heart by the listeners. "I guess about all we can do is go home and work a little harder and pray a little more. If we do our best, I guess God will help us to work this out some way." War news continued to filter in. At Christmas of 1862, there was the Confederate victory at Fredericksburg. Spring of the following year brought another Confederate victory, this one at Chancellorsville. However, along with this victory came the stunning news of the death of General Stonewall Jackson. The following July, word was received of Lee's army marching into Pennsylvania. With each victory came the renewed hope of an end to the war, but still it continued. Food and provisions became a problem for both sides. In 1863, Yankee soldiers began raiding Cherokee County. No one could blame hungry soldiers for wanting food, but they were not content with just foraging for food. They took livestock and frequently vandalized places and destroyed things because they had no need for. The Home Guard, which was reduced in size because of the numbers of men off fighting, was paralyzed. How could they possibly catch raiders who would attack and be gone before an alarm could be spread? One such raid was made on the Thomas Tatham home. The 6 sons were away in the Confederate Army. The wives and children lived at the old home for reasons of safety. The Yankees raided the premises, taking everything possible. Whatever they could not use, they burned in the yard. On leaving, they prepared to set fire to the old Tatham grist mill. Aunt Polly, who had so bravely sent her 6 sons off to war, faced the leader of this mob and pled, "Please don't burn the mill. Mr. Tatham and I built it with our own hands in 1835, while the Indians were still here. It has fed hundreds of people, whites, blacks, and Indians. It is feeding hungry people now. We don't have any men left in the valley. We are all just old people, women, and children. If the mill is destroyed, where will they get bread? We are too young to build again. We have no money to buy bread. Take anything you want, but in God's name, leave the mill." She fell to her knees and sobbed. "Please, soldier, look at these pitiful little ones. They haven't done you any harm. Would you want to answer to Almighty God for their deaths? If the mill is gone, they will starve." The soldier cuffed her with his foot, saying, "Get up, you old hag, and get out of my sight." Turning to his men, he stormed orders. "Forget the damn mill. She said take anything we want. Get the feather beds and pillows off the beds. Scatter the feathers as you go down the road." Aunt Polly and her 6 frightened young daughters-in-law stood together under the cedar tree and watched while the ruffians stole their treasures, mounted, and rode away. True to their instructions, they tore the ticking off the feather beds and scattered the feathers for miles along the road. In 1863, when the Union troops gained territory in East Tennessee, They immediately began to harass the helpless families of the Confederate troops who were without protection of their men. A member of the Home Guard rode up and dismounted in front of the wide veranda of the Hayes home where Mrs. Hayes and Mrs. Davidson sat with their girls knitting. "Mrs. Hayes," he bowed politely as he stated, "I have a message from Captain Hayes. He said the Yankees have arrested the wife of General Vaughn and carried her to a northern prison." "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mrs. Hayes, as she thought of her neighbor whose only crime was being the wife of a Confederate general, who was, of course, fighting with his troops. "I didn't know they'd started taking our women as prisoners," said Mrs. Davidson. "I thought they were just going to starve us to death." "They not only steal all you have, but now they have started molesting the women." The guard paused, somewhat abashed that he had passed on unthinkingly this unsettling comment. "They raided this place for the 13th time," said Mrs. Hayes. "During the last raid they took blankets, shawls, and even petticoats. When I noticed the soldiers looking at the bed, I told him there was nothing hidden there, only the baby asleep on it. He said, 'Damn the baby, I want the blanket.' Then he jerked it off so suddenly he nearly tossed the baby onto the floor." "Good God, Mrs. Hayes," said the guard, "why do they pick on you?" "I guess it's because we're so convenient. We live on the road to Tennessee. Also, they know this is a big place with lots of slaves, and they know we must raise lots of food. Mrs. Hayes, I didn't come just to tell you about Mrs. Vaughn. Captain Hayes sent you another message." He paused as if searching for words. In spite of her fear of what she was about to hear, Mrs. Hayes urged the guard to speak. The unknown message couldn't be pleasant, or the guard wouldn't be having so much difficulty getting it out. Reluctantly, the soldier looked at the pretty girls on the porch, then he dropped his head, saying, "Word's out that there are some pretty girls here. Some of the soldiers are making plans today to come and carry Jane and Quincy off. Captain Hayes said for you to run and hide somewhere for a few days." A gasp. The clatter of knitting needles dropping unheeded to the floor. Precious wool yarn drifting across the wide green yard propelled by the gentle breeze. A scurry into the house to grab up the very meagerest of necessities. Within minutes the women were reassembled on the porch, making plans for their hasty departure. Before this could be accomplished, the sound of approaching horses was heard. Panic seized the women. They were too late. Hearts stopped beating as each stood in suspended animation until the signal was received that the approaching riders were not enemies. "Good news," called one of the riders from a distance. He was all but trampled by the happy, relieved women as he came forward to repeat his message. "Good news. The Yankees did start this way, but good old Pete Graybeard, the Indian, and some of his friends got wind of the plan. They went up on Hanging Dog and hid until the bushwhackers came by. From ambush, Pete shot the leader, and they must have thought there was a whole army there because all the rest ran like scared rabbits. They're probably back in Tennessee by now. Everything's all right. Pete saved you." The rest of the men had arrived by this time, and they were greeted happily. They were given water and what food was available. An air of merrymaking and festivity prevailed in spite of the seriousness of the times and the scarcity of provisions. When the group of soldiers had to leave, they were entrusted with messages of prayerful thanks for the kind and friendly Indians who had come to their rescue. As the men walked to their horses, the young ladies followed them out to the road. Quincy picked up her little cousin, Carrie, a wee tot of 18 months, and stood watching when a gun discharged accidentally. 9 buckshot penetrated Quincy Davidson's breast, and 3 entered the child's arm. Shocked, the group watched Quincy crumple to the grass in a pool of blood. "My God, we killed the little girl." The soldiers were dispatched to Murphy to fetch Dr. Patton. Quincy and Carrie were taken into the house. Quincy lingered for a few days and then died. She was buried the next day in the white silk dress that would have been her wedding dress. She and Captain Sumter were to have been married on his next furlough. When Abraham and Elmira Sudderth came to Cherokee County in 1847, They purchased 1,800 acres of land on the Hiwassee River. This was known as the Mission. It was given this name because of a church and school that had been established there in 1817 for the Cherokee Nation at the old town of Natchez. Through hard work, the Sutters had made this a successful, productive plantation. In the summer of 1863, a large group of Yankee raiders descended upon the Sutter plantation. They ignored the owners as they proceeded to collect everything they could lay their hands on. Having satiated their voracious appetites, the bushwhackers prepared to leave. At the first hint of the raid, the frightened blacks had taken to refuge in the high hills. One slave, known as Deef Bob, because he was deaf, lingered at a distance as a curious onlooker. Peacock, Mr. Sutter's prize stallion, was spied by one of the raiders, who decided to take the horse as his own. His attempt to saddle the high-spirited animal was unsuccessful. He called to Deef Bob, "Here, you black devil, come here. Saddle this brute." Then, realizing that the slave might not respond to his sharp commands, he added, "If you'll saddle him, we'll take you with us to the Yankee army, where you'll get plenty to eat." Bob came forward. He looked around importantly as he said, "Deef Bob's the onlyest one can saddle Peacock." With this, he adroitly placed Mr. Sutter's best saddle securely on Peacock. The captain mounted Peacock and indicated to Bob that he should climb on one of the other horses and follow him. Obediently, Bob did as he was told. Some distance down the road, Bob spurred his horse into Peacock and at the same time kicked Peacock sharply. Peacock reared, unseating his unsuspecting rider, who landed in a heap on the dusty road. Bob took to his heels, calling for Peacock to follow. The horse, accustomed to obeying Bob's commands, followed at a gallop, and they disappeared into the woods. A few days later, Bob and the horses appeared at the Sutterth gate. "Why, Bob, I thought you had gone to join the Yankee army. What happened?" "The last I seed of that captain, he was lying stretched out in the road. Me and Peacock, we didn't like him." "Good for you," laughed Mr. Sutterth. Mrs. Sutterth was carefully checking over the house and the farm to see what was missing. The list included 10 horses, 4 mules, 10 sheep, 400 bushels of corn, oats, fodder, potatoes, apples. The list was endless. "God Almighty," said Deef Bob when he heard the entire recitation. "They done stole us out of our house and home." "No, we still have the house. Thank goodness they didn't burn that like they have some of the other places they've raided. I hid the axe so we can cut wood to keep warm. Most of the food is gone, but we'll make out. The hogs we sent up into the mountains are still there. No, Bob, we are still better off than lots of folks." Mrs. Sutherth added, "I buried our best china and the silver. There's still some things growing in the garden. We won't starve. We buried the strong box. Thank heavens everything isn't gone." Mail day had always been important to the settlers in the valley, but with the advent of the war, it took on added significance. Many people crowded into the store each time the mail was due to arrive, and the lucky ones who received letters always shared with the ones who didn't. Every morsel of news was digested and repeated and discussed until the next arrival of the mail carrier. Billy and Margaret were fortunate enough to hear from their son Agnew with as much regularity as the mail would permit. He wrote long, interesting letters, telling as much as he could about his own activities, but thoughtfully included any information he might have gained concerning others from Valleytown to be shared with their loved ones. The group assembled in the trading post stood in quiet attention as Billy read Agnew's letter aloud. Carter's Depot, Tennessee. I received your letter today and was very glad to hear. Your letter was 11 days on the road. Mail is very uncertain. I will send this letter by C.L. Truitt or Robert Derryberry. They are going home on furlough. You may get it sooner than by mail. Colonel Love states that he's going to Raleigh in a few days to see Governor Vance in relation to us going to western North Carolina. The Thomas Legion is in North Carolina. Jackson's brigade is in Tennessee. Walker's battalion has come to Tennessee. I hear General Longstreet's army is falling back. He's probably going to Richmond or Kentucky. The army here is pretty much all gone up the road. I think they are headed for Virginia. Tell the home people all their boys are well. Tell Mrs. Stewart John was sent to Wilkes County, North Carolina with the forage wagons. He was gone about 15 days. He was at Wilkesboro and saw Mr. William Vanoy. You remember? The Vanoys came to Cherokee for a while. He also saw John Finley and his family. I remember he was out at our house once. I sent Father's letter to Grandmother by John. The wagons will probably go again soon, and I am hoping I can go so I can see Grandmother Walker and all the kinfolks there. We do not draw much to eat these days. 3/4 of a pound of crackers or hard bread per day and a little beef. It takes all our wages to buy something extra, that is if we can get it, to keep from starving. Our company now is detailed to work on a bridge. We are glad because when we are working we get more rations. When we are on guard duty we only get half rations. I'm sorry to hear through men coming back that things are getting needy in your section. It has been that way here for a long time. There have been so many hungry soldiers. You don't know anything about soldiers unless you could be where they were for a while. Every bee gum, every hog, chicken, goose, duck, or anything to eat is taken. I hear from Captain Tatham that his family are all down with fever and little Jim is dead. I'm sorry to hear that. There is preaching about 2 miles from here, and we went today. The preachers are Unionites, no Methodist or Baptist. They are all drunkards and Camelites. They preach strange doctrines to me. They seem to be an ignorant set of people. I've heard Grandma Scott talk about them. She knew them in Pennsylvania. One old Dunkard preached here the other day and gave his text as the 14th chapter and 5th verse of Revelations. And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God. We had preaching the other day at camp by Parson Tipton, a Baptist from Jefferson City. With best respects to everybody, I remain your affectionate son, C.A. Walker, Company I, Regiment Thomas Legion. With each letter from Agnew, Billy questioned his own activities. He couldn't keep from thinking that he too should be out on the front fighting for the Confederate cause. Margaret was continually reassuring him of the need for him here at home and the importance of taking care of the ones who had to remain behind. The usual crowd was at the trading post awaiting news when word came of a major defeat handed the Confederate forces. The Battle of Vicksburg, where Pemberton surrendered to General Grant after a 46-day siege. The Union forces were claiming that this battle marked the turning point in the war. The announcement was met with shocked silence. There was not a home in the valley that was untouched by this war. The people had come here prepared to get news of wounded sons, or imprisoned husbands, or even dead loved ones, but not defeat. This was not so. Defeat was unthinkable. Defeat was unacceptable. They had not allowed their loved ones to leave home for defeat. They were not suffering deprivation themselves for defeat. No discussion ensued. Silently, each carrying his own thoughts, slowly returned home. All had come to naught. Chapter 21. As is always the case, geographic factors were a great influence on Cherokee County. This county is situated in the southern portion of the great Appalachian chain of mountains. Its boundary line touches the state of Tennessee and includes the Iron, the Smoky, and the Unaka Mountains. The topography is varied and interesting. The county is shaped somewhat like an elliptical bowl tilting northward, with the spout at the Hiwassee River emptying into the Tennessee River. The Great Western Road crossed the southwestern part of the county, connecting Franklin, North Carolina, to the state of Tennessee. In the southwestern portion of this sparsely settled area of the county lived William C. Walker, who had wandered southward first to East Tennessee, where he married, then to the western edge of Cherokee County. Here he built a large colonial home a store, and also operated a stagecoach from Murphy into Tennessee, which carried both mail and passengers. The trip required an entire day for completion. Horses were changed and dinner served at the inn. When the stagecoach was within 2 miles of the inn, the driver would blow a foxhorn, one blast for each passenger to be served. William C. Walker of Western Cherokee County could claim no kinship with William Walker of Old Valleytown, though they frequently discussed the possibility. There certainly was much similarity in the two lives. Both men operated taverns, owned trading posts, and were very active in politics. William C. had served in the House of Commons in Raleigh prior to the war. Contrary to the sympathies of the majority of his neighbors, William C.'s sympathies were with the cause of the Confederacy. He served first as a captain in Company A of the 29th Regiment and later was promoted to lieutenant colonel. Before the end of the war, Colonel William C. Walker was granted a medical discharge because of illness contracted as a result of exposure. On a cold winter's night in January 1864, William C. and his wife Elmira were sitting in front of the fire talking with their son, C.F., who was warming his hands. C.F. was a medical doctor and had just come in from the cold after having been to see a sick child. The door, which had been bolted for the night, suddenly came crashing into the room as several blue uniformed soldiers made their appearance. Myra Walker screamed and the younger children clung to her skirts. Walker pushed his wife and children behind him and confronted the intruders. "Gentlemen, why this entrance without warning? What is your mission?" "We're looking for William C. Walker," came the reply. "We are to take him dead or alive." "I am W.C. Walker. What can I do for you?" "If you are in need of food or clothing, we always have shared with the needy." "Do I know you men?" "You probably know the one who brought us here. He did it for a price, but he wouldn't come all the way with us. And as for your knowing us, you never will. Your time is over." With that, he stepped back, and a shot rang through the room. Colonel Walker slumped to the floor and uttered his last command. "C.F., son, take care of Mama and the children." C.F. rushed to his father's side, but before he could examine the wound, he was jerked to his feet. "We're through here, but we ain't through with you. Come with us." With this, they dragged the young man out into the bitter night. The leader paused at the door, pointing his pistol at the weeping group remaining. "If you know what's good for you, you'll keep quiet till morning. Otherwise, the whole passel will get what the old man got. Dead people tell no tales." Outside, young Walker pled for his life. "Please, I'll go with you and do whatever you want me to do, but let me give aid to my father." "You'll do as we say, all right," came the retort. "Your pa don't need no help. He's past that. All he needs is a hole in the ground, and them young'uns can tend to that." Walker jerked away from his captors and started towards the house. He was grabbed again. "You better not try that again. Get on the horse." He pushed him forward. "I'll lead, and my friend will be right behind you. You try to escape, and you'll get the same medicine we handed your pa." Silently, they moved down the road. When they neared the Tennessee line, the leader signaled the group to dismount. "Now, buddy," he said, addressing young Walker, "walk about 10 steps down the road." C.F. obeyed. "Stop. Right there," came the next command. "Now, open your coat so we can see the white shirt and know where to aim." Once again, the young man had no choice but to obey. With no means of escape, C.F. could only stand there facing his executioners and silently pray. Then he heard a voice from the darkness. "Captain, I heard this feller cured a mighty sick baby here today. Ain't we done enough devilment for one night? Can't we quit and leave this place?" God Almighty only knew why this plea brought leniency, but there was no ring of gunfire. "All right, put up your guns. Buddy," once again he was addressing C.F., "it's a dark night, which means you're lucky, 'cause that means you haven't seen us to identify us, so we'll let you go. Just keep quiet or we'll come back and you'll be sorry." Daylight brought news of this latest atrocity to the surrounding area. In spite of all efforts, no trace was ever uncovered of the killers, nor was the reason behind it ever discovered. They came in the night, killed without explanation, and disappeared. In spite of the numbers of these brutish deeds, which were reported more and more frequently, one was never prepared for it to happen. One morning, Ann Tatham was in her kitchen preparing her meager dinner when a shadow fell across the door. She looked up, expecting to see her husband, who had gone to the trading post. Instead, she saw a group of men walking in. "What do you men want?" she asked sharply. "I thought gentlemen usually knocked." "We don't have to knock," came the snide report. "Where's your man?" Even in her terrified state, Anne was aware that she should not let these men know she was alone. "Whatever you want, I'll tell my husband." "To hell with your husband. You can tell us what we want to know. We heard you'uns had some gold nuggets. You tell us where they are, and we'll leave you be." Since Anne had entered the Indian Nation in 1835, she'd faced many frightening experiences, and certainly was not without courage. "Mister, if we had any gold, you wouldn't get it. Now get out of my kitchen, every last one of you." "Dang, this rusty old bird has spunk." For a moment the men were taken aback, but soon recovered. "None of your sass, old woman. We get the gold, or you get trouble." Anne continued to stand her ground. "Didn't I say if we had any gold you wouldn't get it?" The surly leader lost his patience and snapped to one of his men. "Get that rope off my horse. We'll string her up on one of these beams. That'll make her talk." Suiting their actions to their words, Mrs. Tatham was soon dangling from one of her own kitchen beams by her neck. "Don't kill her, then she won't be able to tell us where the gold is. Let her down." They dropped her to the floor, where she choked and gasped, but still refused to answer. "Jerk her up again, boys. She's a tough old hen and needs more boiling." This brought boisterous laughter from the men as they again pulled the rope, leaving Mrs. Tatham dangling helplessly in the air. This procedure was repeated 4 times with equal lack of success. Her eyes bulged, her tongue lolled out, blood dripped from the knotted rope on her neck. "Let her down. We ain't got no use for a dead woman." At that, they released the rope, dropping Mrs. Tatham's body to the floor with a thud. "Ain't no use staying here. She ain't able to talk now. Must have been a lie about the gold anyway." But Anne was not dead. She had outwitted her captors. She lay perfectly quiet and motionless until they were all out of the house. Then she crawled to where a gun had been hidden and returned to the door and shot into the group of men as they were preparing to make their departure. The men, suspecting that help had arrived, hastened away amid cursing and blasphemy from the members who had received the impact of Mrs. Tatham's gunshot. Anne watched until she was sure they had all gone. Then she crawled to the nearby cornfield, where she remained in fear and pain until she was discovered by her husband upon his return to the farm. When he heard what happened, he said, "Why in God's name didn't you let them have the gold? They tried to kill you. Which way did they go? Maybe I can catch them." "It's been too long. You couldn't possibly find them. Besides, what could one man do against that many armed men?" Then she added weakly, her courage at last oozing away, "Please don't leave me alone." "I still can't understand your being willing to take that kind of punishment just to save that gold." "I couldn't let 'em have it. That gold will be mighty precious before this war is over. I figure it may save our lives." "Save our lives!" expostulated Tom. "It damn near lost you yours." Then he dropped his head. "I'm sorry, Anne. I didn't mean to yell. It just scares me to think what they did to you. I'm so thankful you are alive." There's an old mountain saying that the back is fitted to the burden. Many times during the long days and weeks and months of the war, people, and particularly the women at home, questioned the wisdom of this statement. But somehow life did go on. For only some that was the case. James Stewart, who had moved his family into the valley across the river from the Scott farm, died with what Dr. Abernathy diagnosed as cramp colic. The doctor tried to save Mr. Stewart's life by cutting into his stomach, a procedure he had learned in the war, but he was not successful. Billy and Margaret continued to receive letters from Agnew. Dear Father and Mother, war news hasn't been too good here in East Tennessee, but the overall news looks promising. The tide of war seems to be turning in our favor. Our armies in several places have been very successful. Kirby Smith has given Banks a thrashing in Louisiana. Forrest has captured Fort Pillow with several thousand prisoners and a vast amount of greatly needed commissary stores. We have given the Yanks a whipping near Suffolk, Virginia. We sank 2 gunboats and captured 1,000 pounds of bacon and other food. Today at 12:30, the Yanks attacked us at Carter Station. They first came in line of battle and fired a few rounds, then fell back, dismounted, and came again. But we always got the best till night ended the conflict. We were formed on a bluff. The colonel ordered some of us to man the engine at the bridge. While we were going from the bluff to the bridge, they poured the leaden hail at us. The bullets passed my head whistling. When we reached the engine, we commenced firing and put them right until dark. We fortified our position during the night. At daybreak, the Yanks commenced again. We would hold up our hats on sticks, and the Yanks would fire at them. Directly, they began to come out of their breastworks, and we poured it into them. About 10 o'clock, the Yanks retreated and went to Jonesboro, Tennessee. When the battle was over, we had some prisoners. There were dead and wounded all over the battlefield. We went out on it and got lots of fine guns and pistols. We picked up balls aplenty. I came out safe and unhurt. The balls came mighty close, though. One passed my head so close I felt the wind. I fired in all about 20 rounds. I took just as deliberate aim as I would at a squirrel on Valley River. It was a kind of queer feeling on me, but still I was not frightened. When it was all over, we went out on the battlefield, and I felt sort of sick at my stomach to see the wounded and dead and dying. It was horrible. I just about vomited. Today we were ordered to cook 3 days' rations. This looks like we may soon be moving. It might be to follow the Yanks, or it could be starting to Virginia. Tell all the home folks none of their boys were hurt. I must come to a close as I have nothing but my knee to ride on, and it is difficult. Your affectionate son, C.A. Walker. Margaret was always pleased to hear from her son, but after reading of his experiences and the horrors of the war, the descriptions continued to haunt her. She began having nightmares, which remained in her thoughts throughout the days. She had the feeling of impending disaster, which she could not shake, even in her wakeful moments. Felix Axley was having to return to military duty following a brief visit home. When he left the first time, the valley had been comparatively quiet, and though the parting was sad, he didn't sense danger for his loved ones. This time, it was different. There had been more and more incidences of raids and atrocities close to home, and he was fearful for the safety of his family. Axley was a Mason, and true to his vow, he never divulged the secret sign to anyone. However, before he left his wife, he explained it to her and told her that if she were ever in trouble, to use it. Not long after Felix left to return to his military duties, a troop of Yankee soldiers passed by his house on their way to Chattanooga. They stopped and asked to be fed. Mrs. Axley was fearful of refusing, but she had no choice. I have never turned away hungry people, but we simply don't have enough food for so many. One of the men spied the hog pen in full view. Madam, I see that you have 2 hogs in the pen yonder. The men can have them ready to cook in a short time. These hogs are our winter's meat supply. If you eat them, my children will go hungry. Please don't. Mrs. Axley knew it was useless to protest, but she had to try. Winter's meat or no, my men are hungry. He turned to the men behind him. Here, you, take your gun and shoot the hogs. The rest of you get a fire going under that wash pot. Whet your knives sharp and get ready to butcher them." The soldiers took over the house and yard while the stricken family remained quietly in the background, trying not to attract attention to themselves. After they had stuffed themselves on pork and potatoes, the soldiers set up camp for the night. The next morning, they were again at the kitchen door. "Lady, we want breakfast. We got a long march ahead of us." Mrs. Axley was standing by the fire stirring a pot of mush for her children. "You ate everything yesterday. All I have is just enough mush for my children's breakfast." "To hell with your young'un," said the soldier as he advanced toward her. Like a cornered mother bear when her cubs are threatened, Mrs. Axley turned vicious. She took the large wooden spoon and filled it with the scalding hot mush and threw it with all her might right into the face of the approaching man. He screeched in agony, but stopped his pursuit. Other soldiers came to his aid. One of them said to Mrs. Axley, "Old woman, we've got to have some breakfast." "I repeat, I have no more food. You ate it all." "We'll go over to your neighbors and get 2 of their hogs for you." "I may starve," responded Miss Axley with pride, "but I'll never eat food stolen from my neighbors. Now leave. I've given you all I have." The hungry men felt frustration. They knew she was telling the truth. They knew she had nothing more for them, yet they would not go away and leave her alone. They reacted like children who had been denied their wishes. They started breaking furniture and glass. The noise grew louder, and the leader came to investigate. He saw Mrs. Axley and her children huddled in the corner. Mrs. Axley had her hand held high, displaying the Masonic sign. He immediately commanded his men to cease their destruction and turned to Mrs. Axley with a courteous bow. "Have no fear, lady. I, too, am a Mason." With that, he ordered his men out of the house and on their way. Margaret knew there was something wrong when she saw her 6-year-old niece come bounding through the door. The child was out of breath and obviously frightened. "Hurry, Aunt Margaret. Ma says send Cousin Pitt to get Mrs. Stewart and you come over. Pa was brought home last night bad sick." She paused to gasp for breath before continuing her message, but Margaret had already sped into action. Very soon she had given hurried instructions to her household, gathered up needed supplies, and with young Ella at her side was urging the horses along the road towards her sister's house. In spite of all the doctoring with flannel cloths, onion, and turpentine poultices, and any of the other known remedies of the day by Harriet Stewart, the patient fell into a deep stupor. There was no time to get Dr. Patton. Joshua Young died, leaving his widow, Mary Ann Maria Scott Young, and 2 small daughters, Ella, 6 years old, and Ida, a baby of 12 months. Reports of Yankee raids and atrocities became more and more frequent. The settlers hid their valuables in secret drawers and hidden closets. Many had strong boxes which they buried in their cellars or in their gardens. The larger and more prosperous appearing the plantation, the more frequently it was subjected to the cruel invasion of looters. The Sutterth farm once again was raided. The raiders searched the house, taking whatever suited their fancy that they could carry off, but continued searching for money which they were certain was hidden somewhere on the premises. Disappointed in their futile search, they turned on Mr. Sutterth. "Where you got it hid?" snarled one of the men as he held his gun towards the old man. Nobody has any money these days. Of course, he knew this answer would not satisfy the greedy soldier. "We know you got it. Now get it," barked the soldier as he jerked the old man up from his chair. "Get it or I'll break your neck." Mr. Sutterth, coming to the conclusion that his life was worth more to him than the small store of valuables in his strong box, led the men to his hiding place. The look of shocked surprise on the old man's face when he saw the box was gone was not lost to the soldiers. Their disappointment was keen, and they continued to press for satisfaction. Mr. Sutterth continued genuine protestations, along with the verification of his wife, finally convinced the men that the old couple was telling the truth. So they left. As soon as the soldiers were gone, Mr. Sutterth called his family together and a search was instituted for the missing strongbox. When this turned up nothing, Mr. Sutterth called in the slaves and asked them. No one either admitted or denied the theft, as no one spoke at all. In spite of continued questioning, no answer was forthcoming. Finally, Mr. Sutterth realized it was useless to proceed, and he dismissed the slaves to return to the heartbreaking task of cleaning up after the raid. When he was alone, pondering his loss, Mr. Sutter's thoughts were interrupted by the appearance of one of his slaves. "Yes, Bob, what do you want?" "I know where the box is." "You do? Why didn't you speak up?" "'Cause." This seemed to Bob to be explanation enough for his not reporting his knowledge when it was requested in front of the group. Then he added, "When I saw them Yankees coming toward the house, I took the box and hid it in the woods. I'll show you." A delighted Mr. Sutterth followed Bob into the woods. His pleasure turned to chagrin when all they saw was a gaping hole at the spot Bob had indicated. Mr. Sutter's first reaction was anger at Bob for having removed the box, but the inevitability of the situation struck him. Even if Bob hadn't moved it, the results would have been the same. The raiders would have had the contents of the box by now in either case. He slowly returned to the house. Almost immediately, another slave presented himself. "Something on your mind, Spence?" "Yes'm, Mr. Sutterth. It's about that box. Whilst them soldiers was here, I took to the woods to stay out of sight and found a suspicious-looking spot on the ground. I dug, and there lay your box. I thinks the Yankees don't put it there and was coming back. So's I took it and hid it on the other side of the hill. I covered the fresh dug spot nice with leaves." This time the box was found intact, and Bob and Spence became sort of heroes in the eyes of their peers. They dutifully accepted the praise and thanks of the family and modestly disclaimed any right to a reward. Tragedy was stealthily creeping closer and closer to Margaret. First it was the death of her brother-in-law, and now she was being called home because her brother Abram was there. Abram, too, had been sent home because he was too ill to continue to serve in the armed forces. Margaret was shocked when she saw him. He'd always been tall and gaunt, but now he was skin and bones. Sarah, his wife, was crying hopelessly. Mrs. Stewart was doctoring with her teas and herbs, and once again young Pitt was dispatched to Murphy for Dr. Patton. In June 1864, Abram McLean Scott died. Hardly had the flowers wilted on Abram's grave when another body was laid to rest nearby. Julius Tatham, one of Tom and Polly's 6 sons, had died in Virginia.